My father told me when I was 29 years old that he had known. He'd always known. He said it quietly. No performance. No defense was built around it. No careful framing to make himself look better. Just, I knew it was too much sometimes. But if I pushed back on her, she would have turned it on me. And I couldn't handle that. 29 years. That's how long it took to hear those two sentences. He had watched my mother dismantle me, piece by piece, from the time I was 7 years old. He had called it keeping the peace. What he had just admitted, out loud, in his own living room, in plain language, was something different. He had protected himself. At my expense. I sat across from him and looked at this man I had loved my entire life. And I thought about a gray stuffed rabbit he had given me when I was 7, sick in bed, after a particularly hard week with my mother. He had set it on the pillow beside me and said 3 words. For brave girls. I had kept that rabbit for 22 years. I understood it completely differently now. Before I tell you what happened next, I need you to understand the house I grew up in. Because the conversation in that living room only makes sense if you understand what it was built on top of. Subscribe. Drop your city and local time in the comments. And stay, because what I found when I went back to that house as an adult changed everything I thought I knew about which parent had actually hurt me more. My name is Brooke. I'm 29. My mother is still alive, and my father is still married to her. And they live 20 minutes from the house where I grew up. I want to tell you about my mother before I tell you about my father. Because the two of them only make sense in relation to each other. Patricia Hart has a gift for finding the gap between what you are and what she expected. That's the precise description. Not cruelty in the obvious sense, not the kind you could point to and prosecute. The kind that operates at the edges. The offhand comment. The comparison is dressed as an observation. The specific memory for your failures, pulled out in exactly the moments when you were trying to feel capable. She was not consistently terrible. She had moments of real warmth. That's the part that made the other moments more disorienting, the way a warm day in November makes you feel the cold more sharply when it returns. Those moments of warmth made me spend years reaching for her, trying to earn more of them. Believing that the warmer version was the real one. It wasn't the real one. The real one was the woman who said, at my 8th grade graduation, in front of 4 of my classmates, "You'd look so much better if you stood up straight. People are going to think something's wrong with you." The real one was the woman who read my college application essay, handed it back, and said, "It's fine. It's just not the most interesting version of you." The real one was the woman who, when I called home after getting my first job, said, "That's a starting salary. I hope you're planning to negotiate." None of it with obvious malice. All of it delivered in the register of a woman who was helping. Advising. Just being honest. The framing people use when they want to say cutting things and maintain deniability. And beside all of it, in every scene, my father. Richard Hart. Tall, quiet, the kind of man who fills a room by being steady. He had a presence that felt, when I was young, like safety. Like if he was there, nothing really terrible could happen. He was there. Every single time. And every single time, he said nothing. After my 8th grade graduation, he put his hand on my shoulder in the car. He didn't mention what my mother had said. He asked if I was hungry. We got ice cream. The moment passed. The comment stayed. That was the pattern. Every dinner. Every car ride. Every holiday. Every mom, ere she found the gap and stepped into it. He watched. He waited for it to pass. And he called it keeping the peace. I had a brother who understood this before I did. Seth is 3 years older. He left at 18 with the specific efficiency of someone who had made a decision and intended to execute it cleanly. College across the country. He stayed there. Calls on holidays. Home rarely. I asked him once, when I was 16, how he had just gone like that. He said, "I stopped waiting for Dad to fix it." I was 16. I didn't understand what he meant. My grandmother, my father's mother, June, had understood things without saying much. She died when I was 12. She gave me the rabbit when I was 7, during the bad week. I was sick in bed, my mother's attention unfiltered without the buffer of school and activities, which made it a different kind of weight. My father came in with the rabbit, set it on the pillow, said, "4 brave girls." Then he went back downstairs. I heard the normal sounds of the evening resuming through the floor. He had known I needed something. He had brought me something small. And then he had gone back to keeping the peace. I kept the rabbit for 22 years. I was 29 before I understood what it actually was. It was his apology for every time he didn't intervene. Proof that he saw what was happening. Proof that he knew. And proof that knowing and acting are 2 completely different things. I started therapy at 26. Not because of my mother specifically. Because I kept finding myself unable to speak up at work, in relationships, in small moments where someone said something dismissive and I absorbed it without response, like swallowing something sharp. 3 months in, my therapist, Dr. Maya Chen, asked about growing up. I gave her the standard version. My mother's difficulty. My father's stability. She said, "You described your mother. You haven't described your father." I said, "He was the stable one." She said, "What did stable look like?" I sat with that question for 3 full sessions. Then one Tuesday, I said, "Stable meant he didn't react, didn't intervene, stayed even." She said, "Even with what?" I said, "With my mother's behavior." She said, "What did it feel like to have him stay even while her behavior was happening?" I stared at the floor. I said, "Safe," because he was still there. And also, like being alone in a room with someone watching. She said, "Can you say more about the second part?" That was the beginning. The beginning of understanding that my father's steadiness was not a gift. It was an absence. The investigation lasted for over 2 years. Not in the detective sense. In the therapy sense. Which is slower, harder, and more precise. The first thing I found, I had been protecting my father. In every story I told about my childhood, he was the neutral party. Just there. I had never asked him to be anything in my memory because I had already decided he was doing the best he could. Without evidence, without examining whether doing the best he could and doing nothing looked the same from the outside. They did not. About 6 months into therapy, Dr. Chen asked, "What do you think it taught you about yourself? To have your father watch without intervening?" I said that he thought it was fine. She said, "And?" I said, that maybe she was right. If he thought it was fine, maybe the way she treated me was just what I warranted, she said. So his silence was a vote. I said, "Yes." She said, "Whose side was he voting for?" I put my hands on my knees and looked at the wall and understood something I had known for 20 years without having words for it. He had been voting for her. Not because he agreed with everything she said. Not because he thought she was right. But because intervening would have cost him something, and not intervening cost me something, and he had weighed those 2 costs and made his choice. The second thing I found, my brother Seth had had this conversation years before I did. I called him in the 3rd year of therapy. He was quiet when I told him what I'd been working through. Then, he said, "I talked to Dad about this a long time ago. When I was 22, I said, 'What did he say?' He said, 'He was quiet for a while.' Then he said, 'I know your mother isn't easy, but some things you just have to manage. Not everything can be fixed.' I said, 'Manage.' He said, 'Not help you with. Not protect you from. Manage.' He said, 'Brooke, I left because I couldn't be managed anymore. I needed to be a person.' Then he said the thing I hadn't been able to say myself yet. He said, 'Dad wasn't scared of her. He wasn't overwhelmed. He's a steady person. He knew what he was choosing.' I said, 'You think it was strategic.' He said, 'I think he chose the version of his life where he didn't have to be uncomfortable. And we were the cost of that choice.' That wasn't the worst part. The worst part was simpler. When Seth had asked our father directly, 'Did you know what was happening to us? Was it too much?' Our father had said, 'I tried to keep things calm. Not yes. Not no. No, I'm sorry. I tried to keep things calm.' A redirect. After decades of redirects, Seth had left the conversation at 22 years old and already knowing something it took me another 7 years to figure out. I went back to visit my parents 6 months before the conversation. Joel, my partner, who had been with me through most of the therapy years, came with me. He had learned to read my silences the way you learn to navigate a house you've lived in long enough. He knew what to watch for. My mother was being her current version, not the worst, not the best, the casual commentary version. She mentioned my hair. She mentioned weight with concern. She mentioned that Joel seemed quieter than usual and asked if things were okay between us. In the car afterward, Joel said, "Does she know she does that?" I said, "I don't know." He said, "Does your dad?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Does he ever say anything?" I said, "No." He was quiet for a moment. Then I watched him the whole dinner. Every time she said something, he picked up his glass, or looked at his plate, or redirected to the food. I said, "I know." He said, "He's very good at it." I said, "He's had 30 years of practice." That evening, in the guest room, my old room, the furniture still the same, I saw it. On the dresser. The gray rabbit. I hadn't seen it in years. I'd assumed it was boxed up, given away, gone the way childhood objects go. But there it was. On the dresser like it had never moved. I picked it up. Lighter than I remembered. I turned it over in my hands and thought about a 7-year-old in a sickbed, and a father who had come in with something small and said 3 words, and then gone back downstairs. He had known even then. And he had still gone back downstairs. I took the rabbit home, put it on my desk, and thought, it's time. I talked to Dr. Chen about the conversation for 3 months before I had it. She asked, what do you want from it? I said, I want him to account for his role, not my mother's, his. I've made a kind of peace with who my mother is. She is who she has always been. What I haven't resolved is him, because he was the variable. My mother was consistent. I always knew what I was getting. He was the one who could have changed something and didn't. She said, what would changing something have looked like? I said, 1 sentence. That's all I ever needed. 1 sentence that said, this is too much, Patricia. 1 sentence that told me what was happening to me wasn't fine. She said, and without that sentence? I said, I believed it was fine, or that it was what I warranted. She said, what if he can't give you that? I said, then I'll know that too. And knowing the accurate version is better than living in the invented one. Joel asked the week before, what do you want to happen after? I said, I don't need the relationship to return to what it was. I just need it to be real. Him being honest about what he chose. If he is, we start from there. My father called 4 days before. Normal call. The weather. Joel's work. My mother's new hobby. Near the end, he said, I know you've been going through a lot lately. Processing some things. I said, yes. He said, I hope you know we love you. I said, I know. I'll see you Saturday. He said, okay. He didn't ask what I wanted to talk about. He had not been asking questions his whole life. Have you ever had to be the one to say the true thing in a room where everyone had silently agreed not to say it? If you know what it costs to break that agreement, type a "nuck" in the comments. Subscribe if you haven't. Because the Saturday conversation is where 29 years of watching ends. Saturday. His living room. My mother was out. He had arranged it. Which told me he understood, at least in part, what was coming. Coffee made. Careful posture. A man who had been thinking for days. I sat down. I said, I want to talk about what it was like to grow up in this house. He said, okay. I said, not about Mom, about you. He said, okay. I said, for 26 years, I watched you be present for everything she said and did, and I never once heard you tell her it was too much. He said, Brooke, your mother, I said, I'm not asking about her. He went quiet. I said, did you know? He said, know what? I said that it was too much. That's what she said to me, consistently, over the years, was damaging. Silence. A long one. Then he said it. I knew it was too much sometimes. But if I pushed back on her, she would have turned it on me. And I couldn't handle that. The room was completely still. I said, so you let it turn on me instead. He said, I didn't. It wasn't? I said, Dad, you just told me that you knew. And that you let it continue because intervening would have cost you something. He said, that's not the full picture. I said, what's the full picture? He said, your mother has a history. Her childhood was difficult. She doesn't fully know she's doing it. I've always tried to protect her from the full weight of her own behavior. I said, while I carried it. He looked at his hands. I said, Seth told me what you said to him. That some things you just have to manage, not fix. Manage. He looked up. I said, he and I weren't problems to manage. We were your children. He said, I know. He said, I know that. I said, and you let it continue for 18 years. He said, what did you want me to do? That question. Dr. Chen had predicted it. The question of a man who had spent decades telling himself there was no available action. I said, 1 sentence, Dad. That's all I needed. He said, what sentence? I said, any sentence that told me what was happening to me wasn't fine, that it was too much, that you saw it. 1 sentence. Once? that showed me you were on my side and not on the side of the peace. He said, I didn't know how to do that without making things worse. I said, worse for who? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. What do you think happened next? Option A, he apologized clearly and completely, without qualification. Option B, he said sorry but spent the rest of the conversation explaining his reasons. Option C, he cried, which Brooke had never seen before, and that changed everything. Drop your answer in the comments. The night before Saturday, I was at home. Joel in the other room, the gray rabbit on my desk. I had been thinking about what I wanted from the conversation. Not the outcome, the experience of it. What I actually needed to walk in there and say. I wanted to say the true thing. That's all. Not to change my father. Not to punish him. Just to say the true thing in a room with him and find out if he could hear it. The tears came without warning. Not a collapse. A quiet overflow at my desk on a Friday night. I cried for the 7-year-old in the sick bed who had understood the rabbit correctly. That it was a signal her father saw her. And who had been too young to understand that seeing her and protecting her were completely different things. I cried for every dinner table. Every car ride, every graduation, every phone call where I had shared something good and she had found the flaw in it and he had looked at his plate. I cried for Seth, who had left at 18 because he had run the calculation and understood that leaving was the only way to stay a person. I cried for the version of my father I was about to lose, the safe one, the steady one, the one whose watching I had mistaken for protection. He had never hurt me directly. He had just watched, which is its own kind of hurt. The specific hurt of being seen and not defended. I picked up the rabbit, held it. It was lighter than it had been at 7. The stuffing had shifted the way old stuffed animals do. Then I put it back on the desk. If someone you loved ever gave you something small in a moment, when they couldn't give you the big thing you actually needed, and you held onto it for years because it was the closest thing you had, tell me in the comments. No, let me tell you what happened in that living room. If you guess option C, you know how some things work. My father cried. Not dramatically. Not the heaving collapse I'd watched my mother do in arguments. Quietly. The way a person cries when they have finally stopped managing something long enough to feel it. He said, I wasn't brave enough. I said, no. He said, I told myself that keeping things calm was protecting you. I said, it protected the room, not me. He said, I know that now. I think I knew it then too. But knowing something and doing something about it, he stopped. I waited. He said, I was afraid of her. Not physically. Of the version of the house that existed when she was directed at me. It was easier when she was directed elsewhere. I said, easier for you. He said, yes. He said it without softening it. Without an addendum, without qualification. That was the first time. He said, I should have been braver. I said, yes, you should have. He said, I'm sorry, Brooke. I said, I know. Then I said, I need to tell you something about the rabbit. He looked up. I said, the gray rabbit you gave me when I was 7. I've been keeping it for 22 years. And I always understood it as proof that you knew and you were sorry. He said, I did know. I was sorry. I said, but not sorry enough to do anything differently. He was quiet. I said, the rabbit was a substitute for the thing I actually needed. And I held on to it for 22 years because it was the closest thing I had to you being on my side. He said, I want it to be on your side. I said, you can't be on my side and on the Pisa's side. They're not on the same side. He said, I know. He said it 3 times during that conversation. Each time it landed differently. First time, defensive. Second time, resigned. Third time, like someone finally letting something down that they had been carrying for a long time. The consequences came slowly. This kind always does. My father and I have had 4 real conversations since October. Each one slightly different from the one before. He is trying something new, saying what he actually thinks instead of what keeps things smooth. It's imperfect. He still reaches for the redirect. He still picks up the glass. But there are moments, small ones, where he catches himself and doesn't. He stays in the difficult sentence instead of stepping around it. That's something. My mother has not changed. She is 61 years old, and the version of her that finds the gap is structural now. I stopped waiting for her to become someone different. But here is what changed. Without my father's silence as context, her behavior is just hers. Before, his watching endorsed it. His non-intervention confirmed that it was within the range of normal, that it was perhaps what I warranted. No, when she says something that lands wrong, I have language for it. Not out loud, not for her benefit. In my own head, that was unkind. That was a comparison dressed as concern. And then I let it be what it is without absorbing it. That's new. That's mine. Seth called after I told him about the conversation. He said, "How do you feel?" I said, "Honest." "I feel honest," he said. "That's different from fine," I said. "Yes, very different from fine," he said. "Was it worth it?" I said. Not because it changed him dramatically. Because I said the thing. I broke the agreement. And it turned out the agreement had only been protecting one person, and that person wasn't me. He was quiet. I should have had this conversation with him again. More than the one at 22. I said, "You had it when you were ready." He said, "Same person?" I said, "Same person. Different understanding." He said, "That's probably the best you can get." I said, "I think it might be enough." Joel asked, a week after. "How are you doing?" I said, "I feel like I've been carrying a story that was slightly wrong for 20 years, and now I have the right one." He said, "Is the right one harder?" I said, "Yes. The wrong one had my father as the safe person." He said, "And the right one?" I said, "The right one has him as the person who chose his own comfort, who loved me and chose his own comfort. Both things are true at the same time." He said, "Can you hold both?" I said, "I'm learning to." Dr. Chen, 2 months after the conversation, asked what had changed. "Not in my father. In me," I said. "I'm not waiting for him to retroactively intervene." She said, "Can you say more?" I said, "My whole adult life, I've been waiting for some gesture that would undo the years of watching. Something that would mean, I see what happened. I'm sorry. I'm going to make it right." She said, "And," I said, "there's no gesture that does that. The years happened. The best thing he can offer now is honesty about them. And I've decided that's what there is, so yes, that's enough." I went home for December. My mother made dinner. She was warm and cutting in equal measure, as always. She commented on my jacket. She asked about my job in a way that included a small doubt at the end of the question. My father was at the table. And here is what was different. After she said something dismissive, he looked at me. A small look. Direct. Something I had never seen before. Not an intervention. Not a sentence. A look that said, "I see this. I see you. I know what this is." I held his gaze for a moment. Then we both looked back at the table. It wasn't the one sentence I had needed at 7, but it was real, and it was different from nothing. After dinner, in the kitchen while my mother was in the other room, he said, "I've been thinking about what you said. About the one sentence." I said, "Okay." He said, "I didn't give you that. I know I didn't." I said, "No." He said, "I'm going to try to do better now." I said, "I'll be watching." He said, "I know." We washed the dishes together. The rabbit is on my desk at home. I haven't moved it. Not as a symbol of the pain. As a reminder of what I know now. That someone seeing you and someone protecting you are different things. That love without courage is incomplete. That the small gift in the sick room was real, and so was the going back downstairs. Both things true. Both things mine now to hold clearly. It's a morning in January. The light comes in low and pale, the way it does in winter. Coffee is on. The gray rabbit is on the desk. I've been thinking about what keeping the peace actually costs. Not the peacekeeper. The person who lives inside the peace being kept. My father spent 30 years prioritizing the absence of conflict over the presence of honesty. He believed, probably genuinely, that a house without confrontation was a better house. That stability on the surface meant safety underneath it. The surface was calm. Underneath it, in the second bedroom at the top of the stairs, a child was absorbing things she had no language for and no witness to. Because witnessing required saying something, and saying something required courage. And the calculation had been made. I'm not here to tear my father apart. That's not what this is. I'm here to name the mechanism. The specific mechanism of choosing your own comfort over another person's clarity. Of deciding that the cost of speaking up is higher than the cost absorbed by the person who needed you to speak. That mechanism is everywhere. It's in every room where someone watches something happen and picks up their glass. It's in every relationship where the easy choice, And the right choice are different choices. And someone quietly, consistently, picks easy. My father had the right choice in front of him for 18 years. He didn't take it. And I spent 29 years believing that his presence was the same as his protection. It wasn't. He loved me. And it was not enough. Both things are true, and I hold both of them now without needing to collapse one to make the other more comfortable. That's what 3 years of therapy and one honest conversation can do. It doesn't undo anything. But it gives you the accurate map. And you can navigate from an accurate map even when the territory is harder than you expected. I didn't win against my family. You don't win against the people who were supposed to see you and looked away. You build a life with accurate information about who they are and who you are and what the difference costs you. And you keep the rabbit. Not because it was enough, because it meant what it meant. And now you know exactly what that was. Has someone in your life ever loved you and chosen themselves over you, not cruelly, not dramatically, but quietly as a habit? And did you eventually name it? Tell me in the comments. I reread everyone. Type brave if this story stayed with you. Subscribe and hit the bell. A new story every day. Check the description for more stories like this one. I'll see you tomorrow.